The boots are Soviet-made, no, maybe Czech. The trousers are Soviet. The weapon, Soviet. The belt, Soviet. The jacket, Soviet, as proved by the buttons. The magazine, Soviet. The backpack, Soviet. The pako, the Afghan cap. And that's a good Afghan mug.
This is Radio Moscow World Service.
The 25th of December, 1979, when the Soviets entered Afghanistan. It was 2300 hours, 11:30, when we suddenly heard the infernal din of tanks and planes. We got up and went outside. We saw thousands of tanks coming into Afghanistan by the North Road. That went on for days and days. From the information that I was given and that I could gather, 100,000 Soviet troops had just invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet intervention was not just by chance. Afghanistan was a buffer state trapped between the USSR in the north, Iran in the west, with Pakistan to the south and east, and China in the northeast. The USSR and Afghanistan had always been the world's best friends. Lenin's Russia had been the first to recognize Afghanistan's independence in 1919. Afghanistan was the first country to recognize the Soviet Union in 1922. All through the 20th century, relations between the two countries were excellent. The Soviet Union was very active in numerous programs of cooperation in a variety of spheres, such as agriculture, the construction of the infrastructure, and the training of the Afghan army. Moscow was the leading economic partner of Kabul, but Afghanistan remained an independent, free, and sovereign state. The marriage of love and reason between the two countries was, paradoxically, to end on the 27th of April 1978, the day when the Afghan communists came to power in a blood-soaked coup d'etat in Kabul.
From the start, Brezhnev opposed the armed intervention in Afghanistan. He was not against the idea of sending aid, including in the form of military advisors. Afghanistan was plunged into a bloody civil war and chaos ensued. It was unclear how the crisis in the heart of the Communist Party in power might be resolved.
Between March 1979 and December 1979, when the Soviet Union does invade, several things change. One is that the tensions within the ruling party become much worse. Not only are many of the Parcham members being increasingly sidelined, but even the two ruling Halki leaders, Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin, are increasingly at odds with each other.
Several things would change Brezhnev's opinion. The decline in peacefulness.
Le déclin de la détente.
Peace was rather his baby.
Détente, c'est un peu son bébé.
From the American perspective, the Soviet Union is also using this kind of period of détente to expand its influence in the Third World. 1975, of course, we have the downfall of South Vietnam and the reunification of Vietnam as a communist state. And Afghanistan then seems to fit into this pattern. I think the problem for Brezhnev personally, and the reason he becomes so amenable to the idea of removing Amin, is that his embrace of Taraki was very public, right? He made a point of saying, "Don't worry, you'll be okay. We'll support you." When he visits Moscow in 1979, he sees him off at the airport. Taraki goes back, and then he's arrested and killed. And so then Brezhnev also sees this not just as a political insult to the Soviet Union, but as a personal insult to himself.
Comrade Amin having killed his rival Taraki, Brezhnev's friend, he undertook new revolutionary reforms that took no account of ancestral culture and which were misunderstood by the populace. Amin, far from Brezhnev's doctrine, didn't listen to Moscow and provoked the Soviet authorities by installing a dictatorship in Afghanistan that oppressed the people. Within the Afghan army, many of the military deserted and joined the resistance.
In the Soviet kind of mindset of the fall of 1979, where they're worried about the United States taking advantage of the situation in Afghanistan, it almost seems like Amin is deliberately destabilizing the country and deliberately destabilizing the leadership. On top of that, they're receiving some signals that Amin had met with Americans. And of course, there's the fact that Amin had studied in the United States, right? So suddenly these kind of aspects of his biography and his behavior, which on their own would not even be that suspicious, start to come together and start to kind of point to the idea that Amin might be working with the CIA.
In total secrecy, at the end of December 1979, the Red Army invaded Afghanistan. Amin was assassinated by the Soviets and replaced by a Moscow pawn faithful to the Kremlin, Babrak Karmal. An air bridge to Kabul marked the start of a bloody war which was to be the final conflict of the Cold War. A conflict that would seal the fate of the Communist bloc and the Soviet Union, causing it to fall and changing the face of the world.
This is a callous violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. It is a deliberate effort of a powerful atheistic government to subjugate an independent Islamic people.
انقلاب ملی و دموکراتیک ثور د ثور انقلاب لپاره ورسته زموږ په هیواد کې د هیواد د به صورت مطمئن و پیروزمندانه گام برمی‌دارد از مشعل فروزان سواد و دانش.
Au moment de la réunion,
At the time of the meeting between Brezhnev and his closest advisors, when they finally decided to intervene in Afghanistan, the document we now have to hand, and which is the only written document we have, this document is called Document Concerning the Situation in A, and the letter A is in quotation marks.
et on met la lettre A entre guillemets.
So it was a sort of climate of secrecy, conspiratorial, and even some of the Politburo were not told immediately and wouldn't learn about it until early 1980. So what could you say to the Soviet people who would learn from the press that a limited contingent, at the request of the Afghan government, has been sent to help them in a rather difficult context to re-establish order? But this contingent would not stay long, and anyway it was for a friendly country, and we are there to help them as we have already done for years, etc., etc.
When they sent me to Afghanistan the first time, the only question I asked myself was how long I would be staying there. For life in the Soviet Union was peaceful, whatever they say about it. And there I suddenly found myself in a completely different situation. I found myself at war. Of course, it was unexpected for everybody. The objective was clear, but they should have decided from the start how long it would take to achieve it and be able to withdraw.
The Soviets had wanted to get out of Afghanistan almost from the moment that they went in. right? So they were there from 1979 to 1989, but they had never intended to be there for 10 years. And they were looking for a way out very early on. So already in 1980,
When they decided this, they made a mistake. They didn't talk about the duration of the occupation. How long would our troops stay there? A month? A year? 2 years? 3 years? In my opinion, that was very important, as the events that followed proved. This intervention, the deployment of troops, was warmly welcomed by the Americans because they wanted it. They wanted the Soviet Union to intervene militarily somewhere or other. And there was Afghanistan. What could be better for them? They were well pleased, because it was very clear that the United States and other Western countries did all they could so that the Soviet Union would go to war to weaken the country economically, militarily, and politically. And with Afghanistan, that's exactly what happened.
The military, the professional military, as far as we know, was not very happy with this decision, and they'd actually warned the civilian leadership that it would be a mistake. The Soviet military was geared towards fighting a war in Europe. That was their main goal, right? Or their main kind of purpose was protecting the Soviet Union against a repeat of World War II, against an attack from NATO, being ready for nuclear war, etc. They were not prepared to fight a war, essentially a guerrilla war, or a war against guerrilla forces in Afghanistan, and they knew that. They knew that this was not what they'd been training for, but not what they were kind of prepared for. And of course, they understood that professionally, if the war did not go well, they would be the ones who would be held responsible and who would.
We had good relations with the Afghans, and our intervention, the deployment of our troops, was greeted by the population with joy. They welcomed us, but then immediately began the so-called resistance. I stress the word so-called because at once they started to receive lots of money from Pakistan. It was clear that it was the Americans who, through the Pakistan, were giving money to the Mujahideen. That was fine for them. Making war, they were used to it all their lives. They were always at war with someone. Fundamental Afghan resistance, if I dare say so, really was spontaneous and popular. The campaigns were bound to obey the central government, which had become detested because it was anti-Muslim, among other things. We were a group of about 20 or maybe 30 Mujahideen, and many were very young men. I had some good friends in this group. May they rest in peace, and may God forgive them, they are martyrs. So we planned and prepared the attack well. I asked them, "Have you got incendiary bullets?" They replied, "Yes, we have." So I asked them to find out which vehicle in the Soviet convoy was carrying the reserve fuel. Tell me if it's in the lead or in the middle of the convoy. We waited for the convoy to arrive on a slope, and then we fired first at the vehicle with the tank of reserve fuel. After that, the convoy was blocked. The armored cars caught fire and the Soviets were all killed. There, that's how it happened. After that attack, we captured 30 or 50 weapons.
One of our groups was caught in an ambush. One of my friends that everyone here knows commanded this group. The fighting was very violent. Some were beheaded or had their eyes put out. The first thing you feel when your friend is dead is a desire for revenge. Revenge. I thought about the magazine in my weapon, and I wanted to empty it into my enemies. Wanting revenge overrides everything else.
The Soviet reaction was what you might call a sort of genocide by deportation. Push all the regions situated between the circular route connecting the Afghan towns between them and the Pakistan or Iranian frontiers. So push all these people from the main frontier towards the exterior, like the Soviet strategy used in Central Asia in the 1920s and early 1930s, namely surround, isolate, crush. That put about 3 million Afghans into the hands of the Pakistanis and 2 million Afghans into the hands of the Iranians. That left both Pakistanis and Iranians to play their own cards with their own preferences as to who would become a general Afghan resistance fighter.
Soviet society was kept in absolutely total ignorance of what was going on in Afghanistan. It was kept in ignorance because you have to understand that the Soviet media were in the hands of the Communist Party and kept in control. From the press, radio and television, all the Soviet media, you could never really learn what was happening abroad because information was filtered and controlled. The popularity of the Soviet regime before the intervention was very low. You saw a general disinterest, total political apathy about the regime and a lack of belief in communism. What's more, you have shortages of the simplest things, a regime that doesn't know how to feed its own people. What is this regime about, people think? The tenuous hope of a possible rapprochement with the West was to be definitely killed off by Afghanistan. And they knew the consequences with multiple sanctions taken against the Soviet Union, an embargo on cereals, an embargo on technologies, and the boycott of the Moscow Olympics in 1980. In terms of image, Afghanistan was absolutely catastrophic for the USSR.
Puis on arrive à la mort de Brejnev.
Then we come to the death of Brezhnev.
Plusieurs jours.
The funeral continued for several days, and on the television we'd see this coffin on the Red Square. And I remember this absolutely soporific spectacle with these old fossils carrying the coffin, the leaders of the Politburo who were over 70 years old. The deplorable spectacle of this cortege, of this funeral, is the image of a regime at its last gasp.
The Soviet Union is in its death throes, and the old guard in power chose an old sick man to succeed Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov.
Yuri Andropov?
Yuri Andropov. We knew him as a man of the KGB.
Le KGB, ce sont les services secrets russes, la police.
He headed the KGB, the Russian secret service, and political police force, a double function from 1967 to 1982.
Une période d'âge d'or au KGB.
He was the incarnation of the golden age of the KGB, with its major operations that were launched abroad under Andropov in Latin America and Africa. It was also the time when dissidents were arrested and confined to psychiatric hospitals and a period of great repression.
So Andropov had the problem of engaging in dialogue with the United States. But in fact, when he came to power, the situation was entrenched, and Soviet-American relations were very bad. And we could even say there was a deterioration in East-West relations. They had arrived at a phase that you couldn't speak of as a Cold War, but you might call it a chilly war, because there wasn't the intensity of a real Cold War, but there was clearly a degradation in East-West relations that didn't date from his accession to power, but went further back, because the degradation in relations began in the second half of the 1970s.
I'm a pilot in the Soviet Air Force. My name is Vladimir Kolesnikov. Before coming here to Afghanistan, I only had a subjective idea based on what I was told. But that means in reality absolutely nothing at all. But naturally I had my doubts, and I knew that if I came here, anything could happen to me.
Progressively, doubts began to appear, and doubts grew in proportion as they began to have huge losses. And the young soldiers who came back, those who came back alive, talked and began to tell about the atrocities they'd suffered or that they had inflicted, because both sides were violent, and all that began to attract criticism.
My mission today was to seek out caravans and targets to strike. I think that the only people who could understand how I feel and what we experience here are those who were in the Vietnam War. They lived through the same thing and were exposed to the same dangers as we are. In all countries, in all societies, people look out for themselves, their own daily problems. And in the Soviet Union, people don't know all that happens here in Afghanistan. But when we go back, there are people who will be asking questions. They'll ask us questions, but I know now that they won't understand anything about our life here, because this is really a dirty war.
The famous Zinc coffins, according to the terrible expression that refers to the fact that the dead were transported back in sealed coffins, and their families felt deprived of mourning. And they obviously suffered even more because they imagined the worst. All that would lead to a degradation of the image of this war that was not at all lawful, that raised questions and much anger in the Soviet population, who began to realize that they had been lied to, who finally realized that the army had never been welcome in Afghanistan, and all that would give rise to more and more incomprehension about a war that the people perceived as not being in the least bit lawful.
We sometimes had to take the coffins back home, to our country. And I make no mistake when I say that the most difficult mission for me and my comrades was to transport and bring back those coffins. Not one single mother accepted our explanation that her son had fulfilled his international duty and that he'd been a good soldier. For a mother's heart, such words had no importance, and nothing could replace the son who'd been killed. Trying to comfort them was what was hardest for us.
Par le biais de cette
Because of these famous zinc coffins, there came about the civil opinion, civil society's opinion, the soldiers' mothers, that finally came to embody a form of rejection of this war in Afghanistan.
While Russian society rejected this war, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan was a godsend for the United States, who were thus able to justify their international policy.
In 1983, you had Reagan coming to power, and that was the year of the famous Evil Empire speech.
Ronald Reagan built the whole of his election campaign, in fact, on an anti-Soviet message, versus Jimmy Carter, who was accused of having been, in the end, very weak, and to have been too conciliatory during the negotiations for a thaw, and not to have done enough to come out on top. So it was Reagan's very strong message that he developed between 1981 and 1983. And the theme of the evil empire was a way of justifying his choice and his declarations during the election period. A speech that he made to a religious assembly, because Reagan was very aware that in the United States itself there was a pacifism of a religious nature that might prove to be an obstacle to his policy that was extremely bellicose in regard to the USSR.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Reagan would be described in Soviet propaganda as completely hawkish, like a cowboy who was always ready to draw and fire.
Are we occupants, as they say in the United States, in the West? Are we living or occupying Afghan palaces or houses? No. We live in tents or in houses that we have built with our own materials. We eat our own food imported from the USSR to provide for our own needs. The only thing we take without paying for it in this country is the air that we breathe.
You know, as in Vietnam, the Soviets were hoping, the Americans, Vietnam, were always hoping that it would be the South Vietnamese who would deal with the communist insurgency, and that the Americans would just be there in a supporting role, carrying out some operations, but mostly focusing on training and intelligence, etc. And in a very similar way, this is what the Soviets were hoping that their military could do in Afghanistan. Also, as the case was in Vietnam, it was very hard to maintain security once an operation was finished. So the American forces would pull back to their forward bases, and once again the terrain would be open. And of course, both shared a kind of, let's say, materialist idea of what it would take to win the majority of the population over to their own side. I mean, the Soviets also thought, okay, we need to do economic development, we need to provide aid, we need to provide, food and medicine and all of these things. And that will make people more amenable to the communist government in Afghanistan. And so they spent a lot of resources on this, but of course, in the end, that wasn't enough.
And for Andropov, who was very ill at that time, it was the proof of his worst fears. And we were to see a coincidence of several events that were to augment Andropov's thesis that the United States wanted to provoke a war.
We're going to go by the town of Sharika. It's highly dangerous along here. From here on begins the most dangerous zone in the region. We control this route from 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock. But after that, in the evening, it's controlled by the Mujahideen, who are observing us and sometimes fire at us during the day.
Look out! Get down, men. Take cover. They're firing ahead. Oh, a rocket landed right in front of our tank. Congratulations, comrade capitalists. If the Mujahideen named your weapons a bit better, nobody would ever see your film.
From the moment that the United States decided, after 1985, that this Afghan resistance would last, that international Islam got the idea that this was not essentially a war between Americans and Soviets by way of the Afghans, and that Afghan resistance was real and deep and Muslim. That was the moment when the Americans felt, with the Reagan administration, that they had the necessary political cover with their Pakistani allies to bring anti-aircraft weapons for the resistance groups. But the Americans didn't bring aid to those they should have. While some groups of resistance fighters declared the jihad, holy war, to regain freedom and chase the Soviet army out of their country, other extremist groups took advantage of the situation. They allied themselves with the Pakistani Secret Service to dupe the Americans. That way, the greater part of the arms and munitions fell into the hands of the radical fundamentalist groups, starting with a group led by a certain Bin Laden. However, in the Panjshir, a valley in the northeast of the country, there were people resisting attack by the Soviets. Here, none of the American aid arrived, and recycling of every sort of material was legion. In the Panjshir, it was DIY and Plan B. Here, in the valley of the Panjshir, we have nothing other than Soviet arms captured from the enemy and salvaged. Leading these Mujahideen, these resistance fighters, was a 28-year-old commandant, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Massoud, a Tajik, was ignored by the Americans, but all the same he would do the impossible, hold fast and resist the Red Army, even though it was reputed to be the most powerful in the world.
I say quite clearly that we have no direct or indirect relations with the Americans. And at the last attack, no country came to my aid. The articles that appeared in the United States were not true, full of lies. They were not true.
His charm, his natural charisma, and his military exploits against the Soviets were to make him a symbol of Afghan resistance. They respected the chief, they loved the man. But in the valley, apart from his talents as a strategist and combatant, he was above all known for having put in place, in the Panjshir, structures for a state system based on respect for Islam. Ahmad Shah Massoud was young, tall, handsome with fine features. He was very charismatic, spoke well and clearly. He had a great influence on the men. He was very kind. He was an exceptional figure in the history of Afghanistan. He was popular. He didn't stand out in a crowd. It was as if he was camouflaged among the people. He was with the people. No different. About his military actions, there's no doubt that he was a real strategist, and he had a military ethos and exceptional talent. But his human values were much more in evidence. You have to stress that. He was a great humanist. As I often said, he was the most peaceful man I ever knew, but who found himself in the worst of circumstances, war. And even while Afghanistan was at war with the Soviets, he thought in the long term. He thought about schools. He considered their future constructions. He had prepared places where children could already study. Massoud, my thoughts about him were very positive. He was very intelligent, cultivated, never making an unconsidered decision. He always kept his word, however difficult that might be, and at the same time, he was someone who really did a great deal for his people. While Massoud fought the Red Army, Soviet life in Moscow passed slowly by under the gaze of Lenin, until the day when the old Chernenko, who had succeeded Andropov, died. This is March 1985, and a young man has succeeded him, a new Soviet leader who will shape destiny in Afghanistan and the USSR.
This time, the hour had come for Mikhail Gorbachev, the heir apparent to Andropov. He was promoted to the post of General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and so would be the last General Secretary. The man was the antithesis of his predecessors, because he was only 50 years old, born in 1931 in Stavropol in Caucasia, a man from the provinces, a man of lowly origins, the son and grandson of peasants. And he would prove to be a very good authority on agricultural questions. It was his specialty, his trademark. And that is why he was called to Moscow to join the Politburo as early as 1980.
Le bureau politique dès 1980. Donc une carrière assez rapide.
So, his rise had been rapid, due to his charisma, and also because he was somewhat at ease with himself.
C'est quelqu'un qui a une aisance.
He talked without notes.
Il s'exprime sans notes.
He could improvise, and for that, in the eyes of the Soviet population, who saw how he was, that was a novelty. They saw how he appeared before the populace, and that was a new thing, because his predecessors had very little direct contact with the people. Gorbachev visited factories. He talked to people. He took the floor. They saw that he was closely interested in Soviet daily life and its citizens, so all the signals indicated that they were in for a new era.
Une nouvelle ère.
I don't know what this war is about. Why does there have to be millions of deaths? In the name of what, all that? Why are we fighting? This is their country, and I think that they could manage alone and decide their future for themselves. They can choose the party if they like. Our being here makes no sense. It's a mistake.
Светит луна глазом волчьим, нам
мусульманский Восток, пьем пакистанскую молча, молча подводим итог. Ветровой в степи унылой и протухшая вода. Эх, Афган, я тебя до могилы не забуду никогда. Эх, Афган, я тебя до могилы не забуду никогда.
1985 was the most atrocious year of the whole Soviet war, because Gorbachev came to power and the generals wanted to persuade him that we could win. But that meant pulling out all the stops before the resistance fighters got American anti-aircraft weapons. So 1985 was a summer of drubbing. Tens of thousands of peasants with their livestock were massacred. Then, as soon as anti-aircraft weapons made their appearance in the resistance, it was enough that, statistically, a Soviet plane or helicopter per day was shot down. No Soviet pilot wanted to be part of that statistic. The result? When I say night and day, it's that we crossed the desert by night up until 1985. After 1986, we traveled by day, and the Soviet air transports no longer flew by night because they were so afraid of being shot down. As soon as the occupying forces on the ground lost their air cover, Soviet occupation was doomed. When Gorbachev came to power and perestroika started, he understood, or more exactly, I think someone whispered in his ear, that 6 years in Afghanistan was far too much for our troops.
6 лет пребывания войск в Афганистане – это много очень.
Much money was spent too. Material, financial, moral, and human resources were wasted. It wasn't good for us or our country. Moreover, at that time, we often heard it said, including in the Soviet Union, that after 6 years, we still could not claim a single victory in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan was a thorn in Gorbachev's foot because it was a war that they called the Russian Vietnam. It was a war with considerable losses to the Soviet Union and for which the population suffered. There was also the problem of foreign policy. While Gorbachev finally failed to settle this question, the West judged him as usual, saying that while the affair continued unsettled, while the war was not over, the Soviet Union was still continuing as of old. So he had absolutely to show that he had changed his policy and that the USSR was moving into a new era. So it was essential for him to sort this out. Nothing was going to be easy because the Americans were extremely reserved, not knowing how they should react. But confidence was progressively established. That was because Gorbachev would make plenty of concessions. He was the one to make the most.
И проведя консультации с правительством Демократической Республики Афганистан, советское руководство приняло решение, о котором я сегодня официально объявляю. До конца 1986 года из Афганистана будут возвращены на родину 6 полков, 1 танковый, 2 мотострелковых и 3 зенитных с их штатной техникой и вооружениями.
I returned to Afghanistan as commander of the 40th Army, heading all the Soviet forces present in Afghanistan. My mission was very clear: to prepare for the return of the troops and evacuate our army without loss. How come a little valley with only 5,000 men and 700 weapons could beat the most powerful army in the world, the Red Army?
It's thanks to the structure of the valley, with its mountains and rivers. That was good for us. For the enemy, it was very bad.
Massoud stood up to the Soviets for 10 years, and they never took his stronghold, the Panjshir Valley. He held the key to a successful withdrawal because the Mujahideen controlled part of the road that linked Kabul to the USSR. Relations with General Gromov were respectful and cordial. With Massoud, we never met in the Panjshir, always on neutral territory. For example, on the main road from Kabul to the Salang Pass, where the Panjshir Valley begins. We agreed on a very precise site. I arrived by helicopter and he on horseback or by jeep, accompanied by one or two of his guards, of course.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи. Заявление советского правительства. Действуя в точном соответствии с Женевскими соглашениями, СССР завершил вывод советских войск из Афганистана. В этой стране не осталось ни одного советского солдата.
Сегодня нам опять, как и вчера, с утра работа наша боевая. И по команде мы уйдем, ведь нам пора лететь туда, где мы нужны, где нету рая. Благословит нас Всевышний на удачу. Нам кровь из носа надо выполнить задачу. И мы взлетаем и уходим в тот район, где бой ведет десантный батальон. И мы взлетаем и уходим в тот район, где бой ведет десантный батальон. Расчет простой и цели нам ясны. Ну что ж, тогда еще по сигарете. Друг другу мы останемся верны. Иначе нам не жить на белом свете. И мы взлетаем и уходим в тот район, где бой ведет десантный батальон.
I can confirm that behind me there remains not a single Soviet soldier. So ends our 9-year stay.
Here is your son.
И тысячи людей сейчас ждут в Термезе наших воинов.
When I was on the bridge, I didn't expect to be greeted by my eldest son. I was full of emotion, and at the same time I was submerged by a feeling of relief and despair. As I came to realize at that precise moment I had carried a huge responsibility on my shoulders for many years. The nervous tension was immense because the situation had been very hard and complicated. And that nervous tension had provoked a feeling of total emptiness as I crossed the bridge. I had the impression that my life had ended, and yes, inside me, I felt a great void. During the 1980s, my whole life had been tied to Afghanistan, like the lives of hundreds of thousands of Soviet families, and like those of my friends and my own family. And suddenly, after this war, came the start of the 1990s, years that were so difficult that they destroyed our country.
Вы! Убери руки, шакал! Ну тихо, тихо! Убери руки, я тебе сказал! Убери сигарету!
Indeed, in the Soviet Union, the slogans changed, speech became free, and critics were more and more virulent against Gorbachev and authority. People called for him to resign and wanted real change. Gorbachev failed his perestroika. The economic crisis hit the country hard, Shops were still as empty, and the population no longer believed either in Gorbachev or the bright future of communism. But with perestroika and glasnost, he'd opened Pandora's box and started an irreversible movement. History was in full swing. 9 months after the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Freedom triumphed. And even in Moscow, they toppled the statues, starting with Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka, the ancestor of the KGB. Discontent grew and became more and more pointed against authority, and one after another, the republics claimed independence. The days of communism and the Soviet Union were numbered.
It was clearly the Afghanistan war that was the catalyst for the fall of the USSR. It played an extremely important role because on one hand, it exposed the military problems that the Soviet army didn't manage to solve in the territory. It showed up the military costs that the Soviet economy, the Soviet society, could no longer afford. That then led to the structural problems of the regime, and so exposed the myth of the proletarian internationalism of this great Soviet economic power, of the Soviets coming to the aid of developing countries and then suddenly finding themselves brutally contested by a small country opposing this great power. Obviously, that led to the USSR profoundly questioning its identity, its capacity for development, and its capacity to face up to the United States. So there were many, many very painful things for the USSR to be played out with regards to Afghanistan.
What was called the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the Afghanistan War, and that Moscow obstinately always referred to as sending a limited contingent to aid a brother country, ended in February 1989 to the great relief of the Afghan and Soviet populations. Both of them multi-ethnic and multicultural. The Soviet invasion, or sending a limited contingent as the Russians called it, was the final conflict of the Cold War. A conflict with a heavy toll. Between 1,200,000 and 2 million dead on the Afghan side, 20,000 dead on the Soviet side, and millions of wounded, maimed for life victims of anti-personnel mines. The torments of war also displaced 10 million Afghans and led to more than 6 million refugees in Pakistan and Iran. A war that was to change the face of the world because while Afghanistan was a totally destroyed country, it would tip into a civil war just as bloody and dramatic, with later the emergence of the Taliban and the new international terrorism. And it's not by chance that this land has been called since the dawn of time the graveyard of empires. Afghanistan was the grave of the USSR, a Soviet Union that ceased to exist 2.5 years after the withdrawal of its troops in December 1991.